Hello and welcome to episode 113 of the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast. I have a fabulous repeat guest today. His name is Marek Doyle. You may remember him from episode 63. And if you haven't listened to that, I suggest you go back and listen to that one because it sort of sets some underlying themes for this conversation, which is really all about the polarizing things within thyroid health. There are a few hot button issues that can become quite polarizing. And one of the things I love about Marek is that he's all about the data and he's all about the nuance and about personalized nutrition. That's the focus of his practice. And so I wanted to get him on to help us to understand the nuance in some of these hot topics. Welcome back to the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast, Marek. It's lovely to have you back on the show for a second time. So welcome.
Thanks. Good to be back.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think if you're listening and you haven't listened to the first episode I did with Marek, I should have looked up what number it was. I can't quite remember now, but it was all on the connection between thyroid and stress. And it was, it's actually, as at this date, my most popular podcast episode.
We'll take that.
Yeah, so take that. And so thank you. And thank you for agreeing to come back on the show and be at my Q&A. We're going to cover lots of different topics in this conversation tonight. So you're my wealth of knowledge tonight. So thank you in advance.
No worries. Let's get through them, shall we?
Let's dive in. All right. So just to run through the rough topics we're going to cover, so you can, those that are listening know we're headed. We're going to talk about thyroid antibodies, keto, low carb, fasting, Ozempic, all the food weight loss related topics. Then if we've got time, we're going to touch on liver health and cholesterol. So like I say, there's a lot to get through. We'll see how we go. If we don't get through it all, that's okay too. We'll cover the big ones first. So the thyroid antibodies question was just something that I know I threw to you yesterday because I saw this question come up. I thought, I think I've been telling people the wrong thing about, I don't know, I think I need to clarify some things about thyroid antibodies. And so I'm just, the question that had come up in this other group was, basically, well, why do I even really have to reduce thyroid antibodies? And, people say you've got to do all these things to reduce them. Why do I have to do that? Is that important? And so some of the comments, the replies to that were like, surprised me a bit. So I thought I'd just get your take on, on thyroid antibodies. Like maybe could you explain even what are they, do they diagnose Hashimoto's or not? Do they attack the thyroid gland or not? And, do they matter or not? So.
Yeah, well, I guess the simplest part of that question is, do they matter? Yes, they most definitely matter. The themes on it were that antibodies don't destroy the thyroid, T cells do. And equally that there's no correlation between the antibodies and the destruction of the thyroid cells. So I guess if we use the terminology that is, now what we do in the modern world, we would fact check that and call it misleading because it's not false. It is very much true that antibodies don't directly destroy the thyroid cells. T cells do, but this is where the implication is that the antibodies don't matter. They really do, because what is the role of antibodies? They will seek out the tissue that they are programmed to interact with, and then they will direct the immune activity thereafter. They will induce the T cells to come along and do their dirty work for them. So, the statement in itself is absolutely correct. Yeah, the antibodies don't actually do it, but they are heavily involved. They are causative. They're driving these issues. So, whenever we've got raised antibodies, that will occur because at some point there was excessive numbers of those proteins that were damaged. And they needed cleaning up. The immune system does what it does. But if it over-responds and produces more antibodies than is appropriate and then continues to do so from that point on, then that's where, we're going to see those problems, because, well, that can easily end up causing inflammatory reactions. They damage these storage sites in the thyroid, or indeed they damage the production pathway. And that's where, if they damage the storage sites, you will see the thyroid hormones leaking out inappropriately. That's hyperthyroidism. We call that Graves' disease, or more commonly, they're going to interfere with the production process. Low production of T4, aka thyroxine, and that's what we call Hashimoto's. To take on the second part of that statement, which was that there's no correlation between the antibodies and the destruction of thyroid cells. No, there absolutely is.
That's good. I feel a bit relieved, because I feel like it's what I've been saying. But oh gosh, have I completely got this wrong? I don't think I have. But so technically, you're saying it is the T cells that do the destruction, but it's the antibodies that are causing that to happen. So they're very much
very
high
much
presence
so.
of high antibodies really is indicative of destruction to the thyroid gland, even if it's not directly
exactly that. I guess the nuance here comes from the fact that between 5 to 10% of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that won't actually come alongside the rise in antibodies. And so in that very specific subgroup, it's fair to say, yes, there is no correlation between the antibody levels and, any cellular injury that's going on. So, yes, there is a small group there that don't show the raised antibodies. So that's where, or at least to be more specific, they don't show the classic antibodies, anti-TPO or anti-TG, aka anti-thyroid peroxidase, anti-thyroid globulin. So that's where I think the most practical summary for any listeners who would naturally think, well, how will I know? What if I am one of those people that doesn't have antibodies? Is this going to be missed? And with any reasonable thyroid testing, that's not going to be missed, because it will still show a very reliable, very obvious hypothyroid picture. That is to say, the T4 response from the thyroid to the stimulation it receives in the form of TSH from the pituitary, well, there's going to be a mismatch there. So we'll be able to see that something's up. There will just be that irregularity that, whoa, there isn't the usual pattern of raised antibodies that explains this. And to one extent, you could argue, well, do we really need a label? Do we need that diagnosis? We know something's wrong. We know there's a value in asking the usual questions. What could be behind this? What are the obvious factors in play here for any individual that would drive inflammation, that could make damage to thyroid cells more likely? But of course, if you want to get that confirmation and, really get a confirmed label, then, that's where the medical system does tend to look at ultrasounds, which will just determine, is there inflammatory damage going on at the thyroid? And if that's happening without the antibodies, well, cool, what we're going to do? Exactly the same thing that we would do if there were antibodies. We go through that process of identifying, well, what are the obvious obstacles here? What are the burdens on the system that would prime it for excessive inflammation? There's always going to be some obvious obstacles, and tending to them often is all we need to do. Often it's not. We see an improvement, just not enough. And that's where we can start getting more specific, more clever. But from a general perspective, that's why, yes, there's some interesting patterns that the post touches on. But the way that it comes across, I would say, I would urge caution on how we apply that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because I mean, I suppose even if you think about those, I mean, it's the narrow proportion of people with Hashimoto's that don't have antibodies. I mean, I would
Mhm.
think it's still helpful to, well, to know if you do have the autoimmune component, because, one autoimmune disease can attract, or, you're more likely to acquire other autoimmune diseases. So just knowing that there is that autoimmune component, I think probably is helpful, and not just think that you have hypothyroidism without the autoimmune component. Does that make sense? Like, not
No, it
understanding.
does make sense
Mm,
because there's plenty of ways of looking at that in terms of the way I laid out just a second ago, which is okay, is there excessive immune activity? Is there any factors that we know will drive that? If so, well, let's tend to them and see what happens, and then either celebrate success or, determine what we've learned and the further
mm,
inquiries that are called for. But there is often some distinct value, in the definition, not just for the way that we then respond, because certainly in that second phase that I've described there, should we be looking deeper, then clarity is absolutely the name of the game. But equally, I think that we want to recognize the human experience here of having an issue and being left with questions. There's a really unpleasant experience. It's quite
mm,
disempowering and pretty great recipe for anxiety too. So to have some clarity and confirmation can have value above and beyond
mm.
just
Yeah.
what me as a practitioner and the second member of this therapeutic alliance, there's more value beyond just does it help me in tending to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. So, okay. So antibodies are important. They are
Definitely
playing
important,
a
yeah.
role, and generally they're used to make that Hashimoto's diagnosis too, aren't they? I mean, the presence of
Yeah, very
antibodies is
much
the
so. Yes,
usual kind of indication that you've got Hashimoto's. Um,
yeah, and for the majority of people, it's a very simple
yeah.
process of analysis. Get the
Yeah.
results. If you've got hypothyroidism and you've got raised antibodies, we know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
That's your
Yeah.
classic Hashimoto's thyroiditis. But if you're in that 10%, well, you'll still be able to detect hypothyroidism with ease, but there may well be a call to look a little bit deeper if you want to get
Mm.
that ultimate clarity.
Yeah, that's good. That's clear. And so therefore, if they're important and antibodies are indicative of, that response to your thyroid gland and destruction of the thyroid gland, then it is still a good idea to reduce them and be actively trying to,
Yes, it
reduce
is.
that inflammatory load. So let's just be clear about that too, because
Yeah, and they're
there
still
are a
going
lot
to
of
be a
people. Yeah.
wonderful metric for how much injury is
Mm,
occurring on an ongoing basis there. So, we will regularly see people with antibodies sky high take some steps to support what I would call the obvious obstacles in their metabolism, be that reducing inflammatory triggers or focusing on supporting those pathways that help regulate inflammation. We do that, and as I said, sometimes we celebrate a quick victory, and other times we'll see a very measurable and a substantial drop in the antibodies, but hey, the victory is yet to be won, and that's where we not only can expect somebody to feel somewhat better if there's less inflammatory activity in the body. That's
mm,
pretty much always a good thing, not just for symptoms, but also activated immune cells. They're so
mm,
thirsty for energy. So that's often a under discussed aspect of inflammatory issues. But equally, we can take away some learning from that. How big an effect did it have to tend to vitamin D signaling, improve cortisol activity? How big an effect to have to re-establish balance between the oxidative stress that the body's facing and its response to that, etc.
mm.
So yeah, we can see what was the impact, how big a role did that play, and that helps us establish what's left to do.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well, I think that wraps that up quite well. I think, and it certainly makes me feel a little bit better that I hadn't been leading you all up the garden path for the last number of years. So thank you, Marek, for at least clarifying that. But technically, understand probably also there's a learning for me too in the detail of the what the technical processes
Well, yeah, and I
are.
think
And that's good
that
too.
the details can always be very complex, although the principles are normally quite simple, which doesn't always come through in the discussions that we have in this world. But yes, the principles should be simple. If not, then I would question whether they're on the money.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and that's what we try to do, like on this show, and all of what I try to do is try to make. We want people, that are listening to be. I mean, I need to be able to understand it, and I'm not medical, so and I think being able to simplify without losing quality, I suppose, of education is really important, because in the end, most of us going around the world with Hashimoto's, we don't need to know every little intricate detail. We just need to know the basics of roughly how it works, and more importantly, what we can do to make ourselves feel better, and our thyroid health improve and our quality of life improve. And I think those are the take-home things that most people that are listening actually really want to know. So it's good.
No, 100% agree there.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's turn to probably the number one biggest issue that most people with Hashimoto's have, and that is different questions surrounding weight loss, inability to lose weight, methods to lose weight, what to eat, how to eat, when to eat, and what medications we can or can't take to make that process easier. Therein lies, a big set of the next lot of questions that we're going to cover. And then, I'm mindful that, everybody's body is different. Everybody's experience is different. Everybody's, what's going to work for one person it's not a blanket. There is no Hashimoto's or hypothyroid weight loss protocol. There is no, one way to do things. So the new, I think we really want to cover some of the nuance in this discussion. Would you agree with that as a?
Yeah, I'm down for the nuance.
Yeah, good. So, so the first part of this is, I've seen also a number of discussions when we're talking about the idea of keto or low carb, and I understand keto and low carb are not the same thing necessarily, but they're sort of within a similar camp. And there's those in the, Hashimoto's community that would say it's, that's really good, really good. And others that would say, well, no, you have to have some carbs because that's really important for T3 production. And, they need the carbs. So if you're completely low carb, then you could end up with really low T3. And so it's been interesting. I mean, my personal experience has been, I've worked out, at least at this stage of my life, I'm 49, so in that perimenopausal stage, and it could be part of that hormonal stage, is my body just does seem to do better without carbs, really without many at all, including the healthy carbs like the sweet potatoes and the the starchy carbs and the good gluten-free, lots of the things that I really like to eat. My body does a lot better from a weight loss, just energy perspective to not have them. So, but I was like, oh, well, I don't want to be doing anything in the long term that might be, detrimental too. So I just thought, be interested to see what your thoughts are on this space.
Well, as you say, there's definitely a pronounced tendency in these discussions for people to advocate for or against low carb, keto, and of course, a lot of that is human nature. We are pre-wired to put things into boxes, label them good or bad or effective or ineffective, and so then we choose which message feels right and tend to go with that, and I think that that's often stoked by the cult of evidence-based medicine, which is the dominant paradigm of how we do medical science and has been for the last 30 years or so. I think best I back up and just lay out what I mean by that. So to that end, it's very relevant that there are clearly concerns as to will low carb, will keto reduce the formation of T3. That's conducted by a deiodinase enzyme that's responsible for taking the mainly inactive T4 that your thyroid produces and then converting it into the active T3, which then stimulates all the metabolic activity that we want. Now, there's definitely a number of studies that do show a reduction in T3 when somebody undertakes a low carb or keto diet. So there is reason for this concern. The key thing, though, is that these studies are really limited by the paradigm that they use, which in evidence-based medicine is very much to take the average from a group that's under study and consider that to be the one true effect. In other words, the one true effect of this type of diet is reduced formation of T3. And that is a problem for two main reasons. One of which is the fact that the literature on ketogenic diets is very, very shaky from the most basic principles, because most people who are participating in these trials of the ketogenic diet are not on a ketogenic diet. I'll try not to labour the point, but even last year when I just took the most recent meta-analysis of ketogenic diet, and first result, there was 19 studies included. Of those 19, only one of them actually had the participants consuming more than 130 grams of fat per day. Oh. Now, that's a really, really important factor, because as most people who've undertaken a ketogenic diet at home will find, it's very difficult to produce ketones with less than 140, 150 grams of fats per day. Most people will do best from much more than that. So, the relevant factors, when we actually look at the food diaries, and of course there's always the questions of how accurate are the food diaries, but when we look at them, the actual macronutrient blend is just not compatible with the production of ketones. 3 out of those 19, the average carbohydrate intake was over 150 grams per day.
Oh, wow.
So again, for reference, above 45 grams, and most people will struggle hugely to produce ketones. Of course, there's nuance. Maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're training 2 hours a day. That changes the scenario. But none of the 19 had anything resembling the macronutrient blend that I would look at as optimal or anywhere near optimal to produce the ketones. And something of a miracle that 2 out of those 19 studies actually showed some ketone production of note in the in their participants. But even then, the best outcome was that 55% of the participants had limped into nutritional ketosis. So yeah, and that was actually mainly due to masses of exercise in that group. So again, still not even that reflective of what people may well actually experience at home. So yeah, why am I going through this and dragging out the details? It's because there's a whole lot of conclusions made in the studies on the effect of ketogenic diets. And the conclusions are formed from groups where a tiny, tiny proportion are in borderline nutritional ketosis, and a lot more just aren't in ketosis at all.
Mm.
So we're making conclusions on the ketogenic diet from people who are not producing ketones. And to reiterate my point, a ketogenic diet is one that generates ketones. So that's a really big problem for these conclusions and statements and the opinions that are based on them. And the second big issue there is that, well, I partially alluded to it in that if, let's say, in one of the two studies that actually recorded the production of ketones and found them to be there, well, 45% never reached even the borderline for nutritional ketosis. So you've got some of the group who are just about there, and then you've got some of the group who just aren't in nutritional ketosis at all. They're in what I would call low carb limbo. And this is really important. And this is where we're going to start coming back to what I think is a much more useful discussion when it comes to this issue, which is what's the mechanisms through which these low carb or ketogenic diets could result in lowered T3 formation? And when is that going to happen? In who is that going to happen in? And so this is where, what do I mean by low carb limbo? This is a dietary intake whereby you've taken away the carbs. So your central nervous system isn't getting the carbs, the glucose supply that it would otherwise want and need. But the dietary blend, specifically the proportion of fats and carbohydrates that arrive at your liver, well, that is not conducive to produce ketones in replacement. Of course, your brain needs the glucose unless you can provide the ketones instead.
Right. Okay.
So what happens if you take one away?
Okay.
You take one away and you don't replace it with the other. That's your low carb limbo. And in those scenarios, the system's going to find the energy that it needs, but it's going to have to break down proteins. You take a protein, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, flick off that nitrogen, you've got yourself an emergency carbohydrate. So, it can maintain its survival, no problem. But at what cost? An important stress response, one that comes with costs, one that will signal that energy is not available in the levels we'd like. And that's where, these enzymes that are responsible for the conversion of T4 to T3, they're super sensitive to all the energy signals in the body, be that what's going on at the mitochondria or calorific intake, poor insulin signaling, poor sleep, increased inflammation. This is the bottleneck, as it were, for the rate of metabolism in the body. This is the real accelerator pedal that the body determines how much energy is going to be invested in processes that are great for health, but not necessarily vital for our survival. So, of course, as we would expect, it's a very highly regulated step. And if you provide metabolic signals that indicate, hey, we have come up short yet again, we've had to break into the emergency supplies again, then, we are designed to downregulate T3 formation.
Mm-hmm.
That is helpful for our survival, even if we do feel tired and can't concentrate and suddenly we're constipated, etc. Course of human evolution. So this is where, that straight away is a very reliable formula wherein we can see reduction in T3 formation. Now, that's not actually the ketogenic diet. That is the just restriction of carbohydrates without sufficient replacement in the form of ketones. So that's a really relevant mechanism.
Okay.
Counter that, of course, you'll have the people who will say, but the way that ketones, or should I say a high-fat diet, will actually impact the mitochondria. Yeah, you are seeing, try not to delve into a world of jargon here, but you're seeing that the energy compounds, the breakdown products of the carbs and the fats, they actually now enter the final part of mitochondrial energy production, that electron transport chain. They enter it at a different point. And that means less oxidative stress if you're using high fats. And that means that the usual protective, conservative regulation of how much energy is produced in order to avoid excess oxidative stress, well, that regulation can be alleviated. So this is why, at a cellular basis, you provide that cell on a high-fat intake, it is actually likely to increase its energy production, independent of thyroid stimulation. There's some measurements that show an 8% increase, which is interesting. And so this is where, if your cell is stocked with more energy, if it is, subject to sufficient heat, if it's got what it needs already, we would expect less thyroid stimulation. There's less need for the T3. And this is something that a lot of thyroid patients will notice during summer versus winter, where they actually need to change their dose. So that's the counter argument. But of course, it's so vital to avoid the idea of it does or it doesn't cause these issues, because it's much more accurate to say there's no reason why a ketogenic diet would actually do that. There's no direct effects where ketogenic diet reduces T3.
It sounds like it's more that the low carb diet could produce low T3.
Well, yes, and the reason it would do that is by causing an energetic stress on the body.
Yeah.
So that's a very reliable way to compromise that process. Meanwhile, let's look at the outcomes we'd expect with a well-conducted ketogenic diet, one that actually generates ketones. Because in that scenario, at baseline, I would not have any concerns. Yet it is still something that can happen. And this is often where, real life gets in the way. Best way to look at it is that ketones and fats, these are clean burning fuels. But it's the carbohydrates, the glucose, that is a fast burning fuel. In other words, if you're going to do physical loading or even cognitive loading, or be subject to emotional stress, one whereby the body wants a lot of fast energy, those are scenarios where you're asking the system to find energy above and beyond what it can do on the ketogenic diet. So lots of potential benefits in terms of metabolism, insulin sensitivity, mitochondrial dynamics, but even enhanced blood flow in the central nervous system. There's a lot of good stuff there. But it's like everything. Let's look at this tool for what it does, and let's look at it for its potential limitations. It's not going to be able to provide fast fuel. So if your body is subject to this physical stress from maybe your workload or workouts in the gym, or equally if you're subject to ongoing, sustained, excessive stress responses, we'll hark back to our prior topic from last podcast.
Yep, that's right.
Then, that's where the body's going to be asking for that fast fuel. It's asking for a fuel it doesn't have available. It got caught short again. It was subject to signals that it didn't have enough energy. And that's where people can find that they feel great on a ketogenic diet, all the thyroid symptoms that, they might be worried about, the fatigue, the brain fog, the constipation, cold hands and feet, difficulty losing weight, dry skin, low libido, menstrual disturbances, no problems at all. Things are going really well. But over time, if that's their only intake and there's this continual accumulation of energy emergency events, let's call them that, that's where the system may say, do you know what? We probably do need to stop using what's available, holding a little bit more back. And the best way to do that? Downregulate the production of T3. So that's why, I would come to the summary here. I know we worked our way around to it slowly, but I did want to really draw out the nuance there, because if somebody is in low carb limbo, failed ketogenic diet, I would have major concerns over this issue. If, on the other hand, somebody has actually got their macronutrient intake right, they've supported their digestion so that they're not just loading their digestive tract with fats, they're actually getting them to the liver. They're not overly stressed, so we haven't got this high adrenaline issue, dumping sugars constantly into the bloodstream, which, of course, at the liver, where it counts, would replicate a high-carb diet, despite the fact there's none going in through the mouth. So you do all these things and then look at cyclical ketogenic diet, one whereby maybe it's 5 days of keto, 2 days of carbs, or maybe it's a week on, it's a week off. In any case, finding a rhythm that works, we can ensure that any of that potential accumulated metabolic concerns through these ongoing energy emergencies, which life is going to throw at us, let's be clear, they're not avoidable. Well, then there's this immediate reassurance. There's that increase in insulin to say, look, we are being fed. We have got excess. Go ahead and invest what you've got. There's no need to hold it back. So that's where, you look at that type of approach, and I wouldn't have the slightest concern. And indeed, it's just not something that I ever see as an issue in those circumstances. But yes, otherwise it can be, for sure. So I guess one little extra that I'll add, as you mentioned, a lot of people like yourself will notice that, hey, I do not do well with the carbohydrates. And that's where, I would say it makes sense to exploit the tool that the ketogenic diet provides us with. But also, is there value in looking at, well, what is the reason for the difficulty in metabolizing carbohydrates? Because if you can find out exactly what that is and tend to that, then of course you've got that ultimate flexibility whereby your body can swing in and out. It can get all of the benefits, but you can also have those holidays from ketosis. You can get the nice nourishing insulin signal, because insulin is always demonized, but it does a lot of good stuff, especially to tell our system that we are being fed all is good. And so on that note, typically we're looking at either, is there any digestive challenges, as in any SIBO type, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, whereby carbs cause all sorts of discomfort there? In which case, even if people are in low carb limbo, just having relief from this major zone of chaos, one that not only feels uncomfortable, but will reliably impact on the gut lining and what gets in and the inflammatory interactions that occur, but also is impacting on the vagal nerve. Millions of vagal nerve endings in your gut lining, constantly looking out for potential chaos there, and ultimately interpreted as, well, if there's chaos here, there's only one line of cells between this and it causing an energy emergency. So again, let's hold things back. Let's downregulate energy release. And of course, people feel awful in those circumstances. So yeah, that's one way through a variety of mechanisms people can feel awful. But also then you've got the mitochondrial dynamics as well. Is there any blockage in the entry of carbohydrate products into the energy pathways, into the Krebs cycle? That's something that can occur from oxidative stress / inflammation, or a lack of B1. Is there any challenges in that last part of energy production, the electron transport chain, this conveyor belt that loads the energy compounds from food ahead of them being thrown into the furnace and combusted with oxygen? If there's excess oxidative stress there, then it's often at the exact point that carbohydrates enter. And thus, we suffer disproportionately. So, yeah, that's where, looking into the digestion, looking into the mitochondria, and organic acids tests can be a wonderful way to actually map out step by step what's going on at the mitochondria. And so, we don't have to, be left thinking, well, should I try high dose B1? Or should I look at mitochondrial support, the electron transport chain, like Marek's just mentioned? Well, we can actually just measure it and be guided by what's actually needed in the case of that individual. But those are the two zones that I often see bear a lot of fruit there. And of course, the takeaway being that then there's ultimate freedom of options to feel great on keto, to feel great on carbohydrate-based diet.
Well.
Exactly. They can be delicious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I suppose at that level of detail is where preferably you're working with a practitioner that is going to give you that specific advice to you and help you to work out, what.
For sure. And that's where, it's probably then veering into that territory that I mentioned. That's where we're looking into the details. That's where, there is a little bit of complexity. And it's true that most people may struggle to employ the wealth of data and the gold that's contained within every single organic acids test. And several thousand tests in, I can guarantee you there's not a single one I've done that hasn't given me some gold to work with. 75 different markers across a whole range of different areas of the body. So yes, the mitochondria is often the single most likely area that will find something really powerful that gives us profound leverage on the front line. But it's always going to give us a whole lot of stuff. So that's where going a little bit deeper can be so valuable. I know it's human nature to think, do I want to invest in that? Is that going to be a good investment? And I think that certainly, whilst I recognize my perspective is different from 18 years of doing this, my question would be, can anybody afford not to?
Right. Okay. So that's the organic acid test that you really recommend.
Yes, such a useful test. It's not like there's any perfect test that will tell you everything, but as a jolt of so much relevant information, that's still the one that remains unrivaled. And believe me, I've gone into depth on a whole load of different tests, and I do use a whole load of different testing, but that's the one that I ask all individuals to undertake before our first consultation, because it makes so much of a difference. It avoids so much of the usual guesswork.
Well, that's where testing not guessing is really helpful. So so to wrap up the keto low carb, it sounds like if you're wanting to look at that as one approach, and obviously there's lots of other dietary approaches, but if that is an approach that you're looking at, and that's certainly, I've sort of gone down that path. So I would say for me, if you're anything like me and you're listening and you've kind of reduced the carbs, you've probably just got to be careful that you're getting enough fat so that you are producing some ketones, that you're not just low carb, but you're actually you're not just in that or stuck in that low carb limbo, which could actually become stressful on the body and reduce your T3. So making sure that you are actually,
the key thing there is that it's fascinating how so many people will have done a ketogenic diet. For anyone listening on audio, I just did quotation marks. But they've never produced any ketones. Which means they didn't do a ketogenic diet. And actually, back in 2015, I tracked all individuals who came to see me who were already on a ketogenic diet. Over the next 2 years, I reached a count of 20. Of those, 19 out of 20 were not on a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, right.
And yet, a decent amount of them had felt a whole lot better from that. And that's where we're looking at the withdrawal of all of the discomfort, the altered vagal signaling, and the downstream inflammatory events that occur should they have difficulty digesting the carbohydrates, or indeed if there's those metabolic issues at the mitochondria that I mentioned, stop them from making good use of carbohydrates. By avoiding those downsides, there was so much relief from that it outweighed the negatives of being in low carb limbo. The interesting thing of all, in those people, you get them into a state of nutritional ketosis, they'll normally tell you, I didn't realize it was possible to feel this good. Because now, for the first time, they're not only free of all that digestive chaos and the systemic effects that it causes, but they're also free of this ongoing energy emergency. They now have a functional delivery of energy to every cell in their body, and turns out our bodies really like that.
Yeah, so you should be checking your ketones then if you're going to be doing this. Yeah, I've got one of those breath meters, the keto breath meters, and I got that. Actually, I interviewed a little while ago, beginning of the year. I had a few lovely English, guests. Dr. Sarah Myhill. I don't know if you know her. And she was talking all about that, like paleo keto, and after that was when I first went. I thought, right, okay, I think actually this is probably going to work for my body, and then my doctor agreed, and it has really. But yeah, I bought a keto stick, to blow, and anyway, and it's been really helpful. I've just pulled it back out again the last couple of weeks. I sort of had was really using it regularly, and then get out of the habit, and that's when everything creeps in. But it's been really interesting to see, just blowing some ketones is like, oh yay, it feels good. Just it's a nice measure. It's good to have that measure.
It really is, because I think that there is so often this presentation of, hey, do this, introduce these foods, this blend, and then experience the benefits, and then as a population, we're crossing our fingers and hoping, well, I hope I get the benefits. I hope I'm not one of those people that ends up with masses of carb cravings, poor sleep, and poor concentration, bad mood, and all of the rest of it. And that's the key thing. We don't actually need to cross our fingers and hope that we end up producing the ketones. We can simply just measure them. And if they're not in place, then we can ask ourselves, well, why? Is this because of the dietary blends? I would say is a good starting point. Not medical advice, but it could be a useful point to look at 45 grams of carbohydrates, potentially slightly less, about 80 to 90 grams of proteins. A lot of people have more than that, and that is a big mistake. A lot of proteins will convert into carbohydrates in the liver, so it's a way of accidentally and secretly providing those carbohydrates. But yeah, so 45 grams carbs, 80-ish grams proteins, and then however many grams of fat you're going to need to hit your calorific needs. For some people, that might be 150. Other people, it might be over 200. It's going to be that sort of zone. Is that macronutrient intake about right? Or is there some discrepancies? If not, we'll correct that. Equally, is there sufficient absorption of the fats? On a ketogenic diet, of course, you can load up on fibers, but typically if your stools are floating, I would put good money on the fact that's because there's oils contained in the stool, and that's where looking at digestive enzyme formulas that contain bile to help break down the fat into the droplets, and looking at enzyme formulas that contain the lipase to then enzymatically digest that and offer that up for absorption. Yeah, that's where that can be a really big factor too. And then finally, what if you are hyper-stressed? Tons of adrenaline, forcing consistent dumping of glucose into your bloodstream. Well, that's going to stand in the way as well. And sometimes means that you might want to make a tactical reversal until that source of stress has been resolved. Complex subject in its own right. But the first thing of all, though, is let's just measure the ketones. And as long as you measured them, you know. If you're in ketosis, then great. And that's fascinating how many times people have explained to me what keto does for them, the pros and the cons. And then they actually experience ketosis for the first time and realize, this was not my prior experience. And having the measurement is going to be really valuable there.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. That's helpful. So leading then into, is there anything else you wanted to say about keto, low carb, or anything like that before we move on to fasting?
No, I think we managed to cover all of the main things there. Yeah, there's obviously so many different sub-threads that we could tug on, but no, I think that's a good summary.
Yeah, and I think so too. I think that's been really helpful. So fasting is another, common thing where everyone hears about fasting. There seems to be every different kind of fasting. I suppose in particular what I want to really ask, because I know we could have probably 10 podcasts just on fasting, but, with a view to, are there any particular considerations if someone's listening and they're wanting to try fasting for any number of different reasons? I suppose you could be trying fasting, but we're sort of assuming there's probably some element of wanting to lose a bit of weight in there. Are there particular considerations for someone with hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, or even hyper, I suppose? Like, are there any thyroid considerations to make fasting,
Yeah. There's the short answer there. And I think the key thing here is that fasting is a stressor. It's a hormetic stressor. What do I mean by hormetic stressor? So this is hormesis is whenever we introduce a stressor to the body wherein we expect a disproportionate benefit in response. Exercise being a perfect example.
Okay.
If we go to the gym for a workout, we leave weaker than when we went in because we've created micro tears in the muscle. However, in the days following, the body doesn't just repair them to baseline. It actually responds and adapts to repair them to a stronger level than when we began. So that's a classic example of a hormetic stressor. But just like in exercise, would you say that any individual should do more exercise. Well, not if they're already doing 25 hours a week. They need to do less in almost all circumstances. So this is where we need to always recognize, how is our body equipped right now to handle additional stress? What's the likely cost of that? And equally, is there any challenges that could stop us from yielding that second half of this process, the response wherein the benefits lie? So applied to fasting. So yes, it's a stressor. It is, placing this energetic shock on the body to say, hey, you're going to need to dig into your storage and source your fuel from there for a little bit. And so if you take somebody in, your average member of society, they've got no distinct metabolic dysregulation, but they've probably got a few inflammatory burdens. They're probably a little bit insulin resistance. There was a 2018 study on the US population, which showed 88% of the population have some signs of metabolic challenges there.
Right.
Which is pretty
that's high,
big story in itself. Really but so there's a lot of people who, overall they're fine-ish, provided that they, pop their aspirins when they need them, and they, don't eat too many carbs at lunchtime because it make them tired, and providing that they make sure that they get that coffee in, or maybe for others that they do that 10K before breakfast to really sort of switch the brain on, or whatever it is. Their system hasn't shut down, it hasn't fallen off a cliff in any way, but there's very distinct burdens. They probably overconsumed a lot of high glycemic junk food. Those are the classic people who stand to benefit from fasting. Because their system's stress resilience is actually still reasonably good. It's the reason why they can continue to function and hit their quarterly targets and get all of the task loads done day after day and all of that. They can still do it. They might not feel great, but they can still do it because they do still have some stress resilience. So they can handle the stress. And not only that, actually emptying out what has accumulated in storage and actually spending time in a breakdown state instead of just constantly topping ourselves up so we're in different degrees of energy excess. Well, for them to enter that different zone, that's going to be really, really healthy. There's a lot of metabolic benefits to having an energy surplus. There's a lot of metabolic benefits to having an energy deficit. And so that's often where we see that breakdown process, not just the energy, but worn out cellular components. That's the autophagy. And so, this can be really helpful for allowing for better insulin sensitivity, allowing for regeneration of various cells and the structures they contain. So there's distinct benefits in fasting. And it's very interesting that if you look at the literature on fasting, it's almost exclusively very positive in what it tells us. The weight loss, the insulin sensitivity markers and all of that, cholesterol profiles, we're going to reliably see a benefit. But again, I would refer back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, this real blind spot of evidence-based medicine in that, we've taken 40 participants, compared them to a placebo, and the average response from that group was, a reduction in all those markers I mentioned. Great. But was that a case that 15 of them responded really well? 7 of them responded terribly? And the rest didn't really see much of a benefit one way or another? Well, that comes away with a very distinct benefit if we squash all of those responses into an average and call that the one-true effect. So that's where we want to look at the individuals. And we also want to recognize that in almost all of these studies, they're taking people who, are okay-ish, burdened, more in line with your average citizen, and then they're actually giving them the intermittent fasting for a month or so, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. And that can be a very different pattern to somebody who has been subject to long-term metabolic stress. Their adrenal system, which is tasked with stabilizing the system, compensating for those challenges, has started to stutter, either through poor production of the cortisol or, especially likely, a reduction in the sensitivity of their cortisol receptors. So maybe another subject for another day is how cortisol is actually a really helpful hormone for us. It's so often called the stress hormone, but is better considered to be the hormone that helps us cope with stress, helps turn off the stress when it's no longer needed, helps us avoid the unnecessary and unwanted inflammatory consequences of stress. But in any case, if that's not available, your stress resilience is going to be remarkably compromised. This is where this type of intervention could have really disproportionate effects. Big stress. Equally, if there's any chronic inflammation, well, we know that the primary breakdown signal in the cells to any energy deficit is a pathway called AMPK. That essentially calls energy availability, both in increasing the release of energy into storage, but also enhancing breakdown and recycling. So really big deal. But we know that that is reliably compromised in chronic inflammatory states. So this is where it's important to recognize it can be a wonderful tool, and that's where, used sparingly, you can place this stress on the body without overloading its capacity to respond. And that allows you to continually extract benefits. Great. But if you either don't have the resilience to stress, and there's more than just cortisol response that determines that, but that's a huge central factor. Or if the metabolic challenges mean that you don't stand to get the beneficial response that this stress is meant to elicit, well, this is something that is going to mean people will likely end up feeling hungry, tired, foggy, agitated. It's not a lot of fun. And some people will, of course, just get a big jolt of adrenaline and actually feel that, actually, this is kind of nice. Then you've got the further complications where people with highly disturbed digestion think, well, great, all that fog and tiredness that comes with eating meals, well, I don't have to deal with that until 2 p.m. now, so I can squeeze out some productive time beforehand. And so, this, of course, gives way to why we have these polarized chats on fasting. It's good, or no, it's awful. And of course, how would I summarize this? Because I've touched on a fair bit of nuance. If there's any signs of dysregulation in your system, if you've noticed a lot of feeling tired but wired, sleep is not right, digestion's not right, this does not strike me as something that I expect people to benefit from. If somebody feels okayish, but they're a bit burdened, a bit sluggish, there's nothing specifically wrong, they'll probably do well, provided they don't then think, wow, I felt great for a week, so I'm just going to do this forever. They use that periodically as a tool. So I hope that is a useful takeaway from what can, of course, become quite complex.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, would it be fair to say if you're really in a hypothyroid state, you know, your body's under quite a lot of stress, that maybe that's not the time to start fasting.
Normally not. So yeah, in
Mm,
that regard, if somebody had, you know, a super stressful period of time in their life 13 years ago, and during that time they developed Hashimoto's thyroiditis, they saw the doctor, did the test, got the medication, and since then their life is running to a very different rhythm. They're feeling good, they've got great energy, but there's still a little bit of capacity for more, but equally there's still the raised antibody count. Well, then maybe there's a sensible question there to look at. Is there going to be a benefit from improving insulin sensitivity? Activated immune cells respond really well to insulin, so that's the biggest connection between insulin sensitivity issues, which leaves you with higher levels of insulin in circulation, and it driving more inflammation than is necessary. There's effects at the thymus, and there's other things, but let's not complicate matters. And so, but yeah, in those circumstances, that could be a really suitable circumstance for thyroid patients to look into this. Meanwhile, of course, if there is hypothyroidism, but there's also sleep disturbances, there's also post-exercise fatigue, there's also dysregulated weight gain despite the medication, there's a lot of these things going on. I'd be really concerned about people jumping headfirst into fasting, because they very likely do not have a fair chance of benefiting, and they stand to experience disproportionate stress as a result. Yeah, no,
that's good. I think the whole blanket. I was at a conference a few months ago, and there was someone talking about fasting, and I asked the question. I said, "Are there any particular considerations for anyone with a thyroid condition?" And it wasn't a thyroid-based conference, but no. I'm thinking, oh, well, I'm pretty sure there is. I thought it was a really unhelpful answer, actually. I mean, I was going to answer. I mean, I just thought, oh, here's an opportunity. I thought I'll just ask and see, what would be the consideration for someone with hypothyroidism, and they're just like, well, there aren't any. That'd be fine. Well, it was kind of like, well, that was a dumb question. I'm thinking it wasn't a dumb question. You just clearly don't know about thyroid health, and so that's okay. I know now that you were not the person to ask that question for.
Yeah, and sometimes we have to translate these answers, and I think you translated that answer very effectively. I'm going to give you an answer, but ultimately it's not going to contain anything useful.
Yeah, that's right. So that's okay. Marek, I'm mindful of the time. Are you right to keep going for a little bit?
We were good. Yeah.
We're all good?
I'm sure we've got more questions in the bag.
I've got more questions in the bags. Well, even just to wrap up the I guess the weight-related questions, it'd be good to touch on the semaglutide Ozempic kind of question, because I think that's probably another one with nuance. But I don't know, it seems to be all the rage. Particularly, I'm seeing it more in America. I'm not hearing as much of it here in Australia, but it's certainly around. So, yeah, can you maybe just explain really what is it, and again, like, is it something that thyroid patients need to be could benefit from, not benefit from? Yeah, maybe the nuance in that.
Cool. Well, again, as we delve into these waters, these polarized waters, I should probably preface my response by saying I am not a doctor. This is not medical advice, but I can certainly provide my thoughts that might help frame such a discussion with your personalized medical provider in the 5 minutes that you have once a year. So in that regard, what is a semaglutide, aka Ozempic? So this is a GLP-1 agonist. What that essentially means is that it hits the GLP receptor. That will induce higher insulin production, and most importantly, for its effects, lower glucagon. production. We are a little bit more familiar with insulin, even if it's often unfairly demonized and put into little boxes. But the glucagon is obviously super central to its effects. Glucagon is the captain hormone to coordinate our response to low energy availability. So it can have metabolic effects in terms of helping to release glucose from the liver, indeed help produce ketones as well, depending on the availability of carbs and fats. But also it has behavioral effects, mainly that it drives us to prioritize the consumption of more food to help deal with this low energy availability. And so this is where people found through the trials for type 2 diabetes that, hey, this is having a massive impact on suppressing people's appetites. Not only that, because the glucagon isn't being produced, they're not hungry, they're able to eat so much less and they feel fine. So that's the main summary. The interesting thing there being that what happens when you take it away? The results suddenly disappear. And that's something that even the manufacturers aren't trying to reframe. They recognize that
they're probably happy. Customers for life.
Well, in that sense, it's got all the makings of a successful drug. Of course, our question is what does this mean for those who want to take control of their metabolism? So a key thing being that, yes, if there's any insulin sensitivity issues, well, that's where you won't actually be able to exhibit the signal at the right zone at the right time to turn off the glucagon effectively. So people, if they have insulin sensitivity, they will often then also have excessively high glucagon. That is to say, their system is busying itself in trying to get more energy into the bloodstream. Most importantly, it's going to force people's appetite upwards so that they consume more energy. And in other words, they need to eat more to reach the same level of satisfaction. So it's not the only way that can happen, but it's a really powerful effect. So, this is where I think it's really interesting that there is some very clear ways through which the semaglutide could be used to potentially help reset eating patterns. It could help reset insulin sensitivity. But I can only really see that being helpful to somebody if it is used as a cycle breaker. That is to say, you've got insulin resistance, so this appetite regulation is off, so you end up needing to eat more food, especially the delicious ones. And that helps
all those
to
carbs
then...
that we were talking about before.
Exactly. What does the body crave when it's on low energy? The type of food that requires minimal digestive investment. You can get all of the calorific hit with minimal digestive investment. That's the carbs, that's the sugars. So of course that's what we're more likely to crave. So so in that sense, anything that can help break that cycle is going to be of interest. But this is where, as much as this, I think, could potentially help people just reset their lifestyle habits, their dietary intake with a fair chance to do so, that would be the main appeal.
Okay.
And that's where I'd be interested in, well, does that now mean that you've got more energy, you've got less insulin resistance issues, the inflammatory consequences of that are suddenly turned off? And does that now mean that you're actually in a place where you've got more resources to take control of things and, start changing these patterns that led to the problems in the first place? As in breaking that cycle. Does that now become more feasible? That's an interesting question, because I'm not seeing any discussion of that. It tends to be more, this is good because it induces this weight loss. But of course, at the same time, relying on this as a weight loss solution is something that I would feel uncomfortable about, purely because you're looking at $1,000 a year for something that the second you take it away is going to, see all the benefits disappear. Because this only is tending to the impaired insulin signaling in regards to its effect on the glucagon. I'm over summarizing, but that's a fair summary. And therefore, it's not actually forcing a reset elsewhere, unless that's a downstream effect. But you take it away, you lose the effects. And meanwhile, you are going to need to be weary of some of these effects. Most famous effects seem to be the gastrointestinal, although from what some doctors that have actually been exploring this have told me, that you can normally get around those with slower introduction. But one thing that is really relevant in the trials is a pretty substantial rate of hypoglycemia. Serious enough that it required medical intervention. I think it was up to high teens, 20% in some trials, that the participants experienced at least one event of that kind. So my concerns there is not just for the times that people are going to need medical assistance. It's more a case of, well, those were the serious events. What about on a day-to-day basis? You take away glucagon, the captain of the hormonal response to low energy availability. It's there to gently bring sugars into the bloodstream so that, you're well supplied between meals. If that's not capable of doing that, then you have two ways that you can go. One is hypoglycemic coma. Body doesn't like that. Or use the only remaining tool, which is a big old dump of adrenaline. And so that's part of the discussion I just haven't really seen elsewhere, in terms of, well, what are the long-term effects of forcing an individual into leaning on that adrenaline response day in, day out? And of course, will that differ based on how much stress they're already under? Will that differ based on their baseline adrenal function, in line with what we touched on earlier? So, this is where, again, I feel like it's really interesting, the effects that it has, not only because it shows us that insulin is not the enemy. Insulin resistance and excessive and inconsistent insulin activity across the body is where we are likely to run into metabolic challenges. But and equally the role of glucagon and its hormonal and behavioral effects. It's interesting, but to look at it as a solution, it strikes me as a one-way ticket to our discussion in 10 years' time, where we talk about, remember before semaglutide got banned?
You're right.
But I think with most things, if used according to its mechanisms, and in a way that respects how that's going to actually impact in an individual, there's probably hope. But at the same time, for the cost, think of the amazing metabolic benefits that you could actually get from doing an organic acids test, looking into the conditions in the digestive tract, maybe doing some fatty acid profiles, hormonal testing. There's no one that I've ever worked with who's not going to benefit enormously from actually looking at that data, acting on it in a way that matches up with what's playing out on the front line. But yeah, you do that for a year, your costs are going to be similar, maybe slightly more than using this drug. So that's where
that's an interesting comparison. Look at, well, if you've got a certain amount of money to spend on your health, where are you going to spend it? Is the sort of what you're saying, and you can probably get better bang for buck for diving into some of those tests and really exploring what's going on and make improvements based on that, compared to the quicker fix perhaps of a drug like Ozempic.
And so that's where it doesn't strike me as the wrong option. And I'm sure that there's going to be, as we get a year or 2 years into this new phase, there'll be some people who are evangelical about its effects because it will have helped them in breaking cycles and resetting patterns and actually moving into a new zone. But I would estimate that roughly all of the people that look to it as the solution are going to find that it's put them in a bind where they can rent lower body weight for their low price of $1,000 a year. And they need to be wary of when they exercise and how they feel themselves there and what happens between meals. There's all these little things that maybe they'll decide are worthwhile tolerating for that, that promised land of weight loss. But I just think there's better ways.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. And I like, I guess perhaps if, people are thinking about it, or, just even thinking about it in that lens of using it as a circuit breaker and as a, for a defined period of time to really work on those food habits and changing your lifestyle, and, so that then you can come off it and still maintain some
There's
of
no
those,
doubt it
really
does a great job of suppressing appetite.
Yeah. So if you can use it in that way, maybe, if that's a consideration, I think that's a helpful way to look at it.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll have plenty of interesting discussions on semaglutide in years to come.
I've listened to quite a few podcasts on it, and, from the completely against to the completely for to the, so it's an interest. It's certainly, I guess, when you have something that's new on the market and being used by large numbers of people, you're going to end up with lots of, different perspectives. But, as you say, it's probably the conversation in even 5-10 years time, think, well, what, oh my gosh, what did we do? Or, oh, wow, that was amazing. Or, I think when you're often in it, it's a little bit harder to get the perspective of like, well, how's this going to play out in 12 months, 3 years, 5 years time? They're different conversations.
Well, exactly that. And I'm sure there's so many people who struggle with weight loss. We know that's the case. We don't need any studies to tell us that's the case.
No. And look, we're, if there's a quick fix, we're all like, please.
Yeah, definitely.
I want it to.
We're human beings. We're quick fix junkies, exactly. So that makes sense. But it is another perfect example of where most people are going to be left thinking, well, do I listen to this guru or do I listen to this guru?
It's tricky, isn't it?
You've got to pick one and hope that it's right. Whereas what I'm saying is, well, let's look at getting as much information as we can, looking at the mechanism. How do we think they're going to affect you? Is there better options whereby that black and white decision of go to the doctor and do it or leave it be? Maybe it's not actually so polarized there, and actually, well, if we've done 17 different weight loss diets and they've all failed to elicit the effect on our metabolism that we wanted, what if we asked, what is the common denominator in all those failed attempts? It's the metabolism. Does our metabolism have a fair chance Now, spoiler alert, no. If it did, then it would have responded to at least some of those. And that's where, you go and measure what's actually going on. I will consistently see people who have tried everything, but what they actually mean is they've tried every protocol going. What they haven't yet tried is to take a look under the hood and ask, why doesn't my metabolism have a fair chance of responding? Because when we ask that question, we suddenly come away with some really valuable action points, and we can actually now move towards that first major milestone in everyone's healing journey. That milestone of having a fair chance. Suddenly, we've now got the option to introduce the very same protocols, and guess what? They now have a chance to actually work. So, I would imagine that, of course, spending the last 18 years doing what I've been doing will naturally shape my perspective on these things. But I think that's a really big missing question beyond what's the best protocol, what's the best agent available to induce the effect we're after.
Yeah. And I think some of what you were just saying really leads us back into the first podcast conversation we had about the stress response, and that cellular stress response, and how our body, has to not be in a stressed, a constantly stressed state in order to actually have a chance. So
absolutely, yeah. As long as the signals are screaming at our system that there is a desperate need to retain energy whenever we've got the chance, we're going to see reduced investment in the digestion, the detoxification, the fueling of our prefrontal cortex and the executive function that comes with that, and general healing processes that are energy intensive but don't contribute to our ability to survive out the day. That's how we're designed. So as long as there is this signal saying, hey, we need more energy than we've got again, we're about to face yet another challenge, there's energy intensive, we don't have enough, we'll find the energy with that stress response. That's what it's there to do. Dump the energy from storage into circulation so that, we're better able to fight, run, or navigate, negotiate what needs navigating and negotiating. But at the same time, it's also going to plead with the systems that regulate these things to stop investing in anything that's not necessary for survival and store energy whenever you get the chance. So that means low metabolic rate, increased priority of storage of energy in these insurance policy zones we call subcutaneous fat.
Yeah. So look, I think I think this conversation makes me realize, yes, we are complex human beings, and I think when we've got thyroid issues going on, there's that other layer of complexity, and so these are nuanced conversations, and I think we might have to leave the other topics for another conversation, because I think we've gone for an hour and a half. I think there's lots of information in here for people to chew on, and we can come back to those other. I'll just keep them on my.
We can do third time's a charm.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll get to liver health and cholesterol one day. That's okay. But I think what I've really appreciated, Marek, from this conversation is, and I mean, it's frustrating, I guess, as a patient to think there isn't just right, wrong, this, that, yes, keto, no fasting, yes, Ozempic, no, it would be simpler if it was like that, but it's just not. And so I think that is, as much as it's not always what everyone wants to hear, I think it's the reality, and we need to try to understand these nuances so that those of, so if you're, for those of you listening, you can be that little bit more informed and you can weigh it up. And so when we're having a conversation about one thing, doesn't mean you have to jump on that. That might not be for you. or you can think, oh, actually, I think I probably am in the right place at the moment in my health to give fasting a go. But it's
Mm.
not just a all in, all out. You do have to, make some considered decisions. So I think that's been, it would be nice if it was simpler, but it's been helpful that you've helped to explain some of the complexity and the nuance.
Well, yeah, I agree. It would be so much simpler if there was, a yes or a no answer to most of these questions. And of course, it's human nature to gravitate towards those yes and no answers. And then you add this 80-year experiment that we call Western medicine, an experiment which, I may add, has overseen the most unprecedented decline in human health ever recorded. And this is a system that, it's subject to very slick marketing. There is a very clear paradigm of one pill for every ill. If you go to the best doctor, the renowned specialist, well, they're going to give you the right pill, not just your bog standard kind of maybe it'll work, but they'll give you the right pill or the blend of pills. And then you'll be fixed and you'll be on your way. And that hasn't worked very well. We know it hasn't worked very well. We just need to look around us. And so that's where I think possibly the biggest shift in thinking that would have a positive effect on people getting to where they ultimately want to be is to recognize that at the start it cannot and must not be about the protocol. It has to be about taking the steps necessary to put your system into a pro-healing state. Because there's a whole load of protocols for whatever concerns that we encounter. And so many of them are, well, some of them are awful, but so many of them are, very well thought out and highly considered. There's so much thought and care that's gone into producing them. But if your body's in a pro-illness state, or indeed you have a pro-illness lifestyle because of the 16-hour days and the poor quality sleep and the excessive stimulants and the toxic relationships around you and all the rest of it that comes with that, then again, I'll use that phrase, you're never going to have a fair chance. And I'm very aware that for some people that I work with, it can be a bit jarring. Maybe they've got a referral. They've had a chat with a friend or colleague or family member. And of course, they do get the highlights of the journey, the headlines, and ultimately the outcome. And they're like, yes, please, I want some of that. And then there's obviously a disconnect when I say, okay, cool. Well, that protocol that worked so well for your cousin, that's not actually likely to be of any use in you. But more importantly, we first need to look at making the real profound changes to change your pro-illness schedule and change the metabolic factors that make healing impossible as things stand. And it's so easy to say that, but it can be simple for others and really complex for others, depending on what they've got going on. And when they say, but I've read that high dose B12 is really good for brain fog. Or should I take lion's mane? Oh, I've heard that cat's claw is going to be great for the intestines. And there are plenty of times when these, I'm just throwing them out as examples. Nothing that said. There's plenty of times when these can be so useful, but does that actually correspond with the specific burdens on their system? And equally, what is the environmental signaling asking the body to do, whether that's the external environment, whether that's the internal milieu. What's it asking the body to do? How is it asking the body to respond? And most importantly, how is it asking the body to use its energy? We can provide all of these lotions and potions and amino acids and herbs and vitamins and minerals that can help various organ systems or various pathways utilize the resources in a different way that leads us to the outcome we want. But if there's no energy investment in the first instance, it's all just futile.
Money down the toilet, really.
Yeah, which of course is often the experience of people when they start engaging in these journeys, because they're ready, but yeah, they bounce around from several practitioners. The practitioners often look at things through the lens that they've adopted. The SIBO guy has a very rational explanation for why SIBO could generate what we're seeing. The heavy metal specialist has a slightly different viewpoint, and so on and so forth. The liver detox lady, guess what she thinks? But yeah, the key thing being that, if we actually look at what are the obstacles that stand between someone and having a fair chance and what is needed to tend to them, that's always the slow burn in the first few weeks and often first few months. But now they actually can start responding the way that they should, the way that they couldn't before. So a very different approach, but I certainly think that it's substantially more logical. And if we cast our mind over the results of doing it a different way for the last 80 years, I think there's only one conclusion there. But that's my thoughts.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I've got you on here for, Merrick, is for your thoughts, and that's okay. I mean, that in itself is a whole nother conversation. But Merrick, are you taking, if people wanted to connect with you or work with you, are you taking clients? Are you how should people connect with you?
Best thing to do there is, if people want to drop me an email or just fill out the contact form on my website, then by all means, drop me a line. I'll send you the new starter guide that will outline what does this actually involve. So more complete overview of some of the things I've just touched on. But equally, I've got articles on my website, also a Substack blog I've recently put together. I've just weighed it in. There is still the Instagram, but obviously there can be limitations on what can be said there.
Oh my gosh. It's not even what can be, well, I mean, yes, there's limitations on what can be said, but I've just found the last, I don't know, however long, it's social media, like Facebook and Instagram, it's Meta. They just don't like natural health. They just...
No, they do not.
I mean, even within my Facebook group, and many of you who are listening are in my Facebook group that's got 1,300 people in it. Most posts, a good post, like that people are interacting with, is maybe reaching 200 people out of the 1,300. It's just like the reach is terrible. So, it's really difficult to get information out there.
A weird time when we have a proportion of people generating content on these channels, and there's some of them who've called every single big issue of the last 3 years absolutely right, and they're the ones that are being censored.
That's right. Not allowed. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I'll climb down off my soapbox before we're treated to a further hour and a half of ranting.
Okay. So Substack, yes, your website has lots of great articles. They're really meaty articles, as you can probably imagine from the conversation we've had. Merrick writes meaty articles. I'll check out your Substack. I like that platform. And so if you do if you're listening and you want to work with Marek or you want a bit more information, just contact him through his website, which I'll obviously put all the details for that. It's marekdoyle.com?
marekdoyle.com, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Marek. I really appreciate we've gone way over and above and beyond what I
always had a sneaking suspicion that might happen.
I did too. I looked at the list and I thought, I don't think we're going to definitely go for an hour and a half. I'm not sure how we're going to get through all of it. But I really do, genuinely appreciate your perspective and your time. And, hopefully those listening have, got a deeper insight into some of these issues that are polarizing. So thank you.
I certainly hope so. Of course, if people.
All right. If you have made it to the end, if you've made it all this way, very good, very good work, because I know that was a very long conversation and one with a lot of substance, a lot of meat, a lot of things to think about, process. So you may want to, maybe the first step in this KISS thyroid coaching segment, the what to do, maybe it is to actually go back and listen to the sections again that really are key for you. That's probably what I would suggest. And obviously, if there's something that stood out, one of those key hot topic areas, if there's one that you have been investigating or looking into or considering, then you may want to consider some of that nuance that Marek has talked about. I'm not going to give you too much more this week because I know that was very meaty, but go back over your notes, highlight something, take some action, maybe do a little bit more research considering your own thyroid health condition before you do launch into some of these different protocols or programs or approaches to your own thyroid health. And I suppose the other thing, just to throw in at the end, is don't forget to keep it super simple. When you listen to a complex conversation like that, it's easy to feel a little bit overwhelmed, but let's just pare it back. What's the one thing that you're working on, and what's the one next step that you can take toward the goals that you have for your health in that particular area? So don't get overwhelmed, keep it super simple, and just take one step at a time. And I will see you next time. Getting closer to Christmas, but we're nearly there. We're on the home stretch. Have a good week. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Thyroid. If you have enjoyed the content, or perhaps you're thinking, oh, my mum needs to hear this, or my sister or my bestie, I would love it if you would share this episode with them. That really just helps spread the positive and practical message of Let's Talk Thyroid and helps that broader thyroid community, our friends and family, to live well with their thyroid health. So you can just, share the episode. If you subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast, it's free. It's really helpful because then you'll be notified every time a new podcast comes out, and it just makes it much easier to find. There's usually a little subscribe button or a bell or follow often is the terminology. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that would be helpful. Of course, if you want to leave a review, even better, just a sentence or two about how the podcast has helped you. You can definitely connect with me via letstalkthyroid.com. That's where you'll find access to my book, my coaching, my freebies, and really everything that I offer in terms of thyroid support.